The Shaping of Gondor, Part 5, The Line of Tarandor. Chapter 3, Invasion. During the latter years of Calimehtar Umbardakil's rule, a group of tribes which collectively referred to themselves as the Rovai, or Rovestai, had been migrating steadily westward across the wild lands of Rhûn, displacing or subjugating all in their path. By the death of Calimehtar, they were nearing the borders of eastern Rhovanion, and raiding the lands of the Northmen, Gondor's ally since the days of Romendikil II. The hordes that were soon to be known as the Wainriders had arrived. The inhabitants of the Stoneland at first paid little attention to these new barbarians. Had not Gondor been weathering onslaughts by eastern foes for thousands of years, from Sauron to Ruda to Ertegar? Surely these new marauders were simply more of the same. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a dire underestimation, for the Rovai were no ordinary band of primitive wildlings. Rather, they were most skilled warriors who had long perfected the art of plains warfare in the boundless stretches of Rhûn. Specifically, they had learned to equip themselves and their horses with light, highly maneuverable chariots called wains, hence the name Wainriders. These allowed a mounted tribesman to both move at tremendous speed, whilst maintaining his ability to lob a spear, let an arrow fly, or slash with a mace with deadly accuracy and force. The full lethality of these wains would soon be demonstrated to grim effect on the armies of the West. Despite his cursory consideration towards the Wainriders, Calimehtar's son, Narmakil II, did at least have the presence of mind to send an additional garrison to Romenelos to reinforce Rovanion's defenses. King Marhari of North Rovanion was also pledged aid, should the need arise. Alas, this proved far too little and late. In Narye of 1851, thousands of Wainriders slammed into the eastern border. The garrisons there were easily overrun and sent flying, and the barbarians surged into eastern Rovanion. Thus began the most devastating invasion in Gondor's history. Across Rovanion they rolled on their chariots like a swarm of locusts, and within 4 years were before the walls of Romenelos. The reinforcements that the king had sent a few years earlier proved totally inadequate to defend the city from such an adversary, and the latter fell after only 3 weeks. Only now did the seriously alarmed Narmakil begin assembling an army to confront the invaders. North and east into Rovanion he marched in Suleme of 1856 at the head of about 8,000 royal spears, as once Turambar and Romendikil II had done. Unfortunately, Narmakil was no East victor. After scoring a couple small victories and minor skirmishes, he quickly became convinced that the Wainriders were mindless novices after all, and foolishly chose to pursue their main force far into the northern reaches. In Urame, near the southern edges of Mirkwood, he conjoined his forces with those of Marhari, whose lands were also feeling the wrath of the Wains. Together, they commanded some 12,000 Gondorian and Northmanish warriors, of which about half were on horse, so the odds were judged to favor themselves, and imprudently they attacked, in what became known as the Battle of the Plains. The Wainriders may have been fewer in number than the royal army, but they were nimble and fleet. They cleverly divided their battalions, and made use of a copse of trees to ride unseen around the Gondorians' position, and surprise them from behind. Caught between two legions, Narmakil's and Marhari's men fell into complete disarray. The bladed spokes of the Wainriders cut again and again into their midst, and ere the day was out 6,000 Gondorians and Northmen lay dead upon the plain, including both Kings Narmakil and Marhari. It was a disastrous loss for Gondor, and with it came an end to her days of overlordship over Rovanion. Calimehtar, son of Narmakil II, ordered an immediate retreat of all Gondor's remaining forces in Rhovanion, and by 1858 the last of her soldiers had departed the plains, followed by no small number of farmers and common folk. Thus the province, that had been won for the Seven Heartlands some 13 centuries before by Turambar, was abandoned, and left to its fate at the hands of the Wainriders. Naturally, the latter poured in, and the remaining small folk were quickly subjugated and enslaved, which served to strengthen the invaders still further. Nor were Calimehtar's woes at an end, for now calamity sprang up in the south. As we have seen, Gondor's hold over Umbar had always been unsteady in the wake of Telumatar's conquest, and in 1859 she seized advantage from the Gondorian defeat in Rhovanion to make another bid for freedom. This time it was successful. Gondor's soldiers were set upon by the hostile native population, whilst an army of Umbardrim and Haradrim struck from the interior, and under these double blows the local garrison was utterly slaughtered in a day and night of butchery. And so, less than 50 years after her reconquest by Telumatar Umbartakil, the great haven was lost once more, and this time for good. It might have seemed that, beset by such grim happenings, King Calimehtar would have had to resign himself to defeat and humiliation at the hands of his barbarian enemies in the north and south. Both Rhovanion and Umbar were now forfeit to Gondorian rule, and vast hordes of hostile corsairs and wildlings now sat at his borders. Gondor's armies had been defeated and sent scurrying across the Anduin, whilst much of her navy had been burnt in the bite of Umbar by the rebels. But Calimehtar proved more prudent and discerning than his father Narmakil, and set about regathering his strength for a counterstroke. He knew that the only surety of the realm's defense lay in the strength of her arms, so he dedicated himself to that task, and for many years made no move against the east. Nor was there any attempt to retake Umbar. Although it wounded the pride of many Gondorians to see it once more in corsair hands, it had been more trouble and expense than it was worth, and Gondor lacked the strength and numbers to hold it any longer. Calimehtar let the city go, and concentrated on the more pressing threat in Rhovanion. To defeat the Wainriders, the king recognized that he needed two things: allies, and a superbly disciplined and equipped army. To obtain the former, in 1860 he dispatched a most gifted ambassador, Kirian Amalstar, to North Rhovanion, both to garner the renewed alliance as well as to coordinate the drawing of plans against their mutual enemy. This he did admirably during the following years. On the military front, Calimehtar personally oversaw an extensive rearmament in terms of weaponry and maneuvering tactics. Gondor's troops, as they stood, could not hope to match those of the barbarian charioteers in terms of bare deadliness. They were too heavily armored and slow. He therefore lightened their armor, giving them thinner mail and plates. He also equipped them with fleeter horses, bred in Calenarthon, or else smuggled in from Rhovanion. Thorough training was commenced in cavalry maneuvering as well. For nearly 30 years these preparations continued, as pressure inexorably built on both frontiers. In 1879, and then again in 1887, Umbar launched major raids on Harondor's coasts, but both were driven back by the small but effective royal fleet. Calimehtar had not been idle on the naval front either. There were small incursions across the Anduin as well during these years, but the Wainriders lacked the numbers to ever properly support them on the ground, due to the losses sustained at the Battle of the Plains. This was fortunate, for if Rhovanion and Umbar had been able to act in concert, it could have resulted in incalculable damage to Gondor, for she could ill summon the numbers and forces necessary to fight a two-front war. By the autumn of 1899 all was prepared, and over the Anduin Calimehtar crossed and thundered into western Rhovanion. This was a meticulously plotted campaign. Although they had been badly hurt and evicted from their homeland in North Rhovanion, the Northmen had by now sufficiently recovered from the Battle of the Plains to fight alongside their old ally again, and into Rhovanion they rode from the north under the Battle of Marwini, son of the dead Marhari. The Wainriders were somewhat disconcerted by this double assault, and now it was their turn to succumb to haste and pride. When, after a couple of small and inconclusive battles, Calimehtar's men seemed to give way and retreat back south towards the Ash Mountains, the barbarians gave chase, believing victory to be within their grasp. Alas, this was precisely what the king had intended, for he had carefully kept his cavalry separated from the main body of his army and in reserve. As the Wainriders' charioteer hordes closed in on the heels of the Gondorians, they suddenly turned about, and on the old field of Dagorlad, where the greatest battle of the War of the Last Alliance had been fought 19 centuries earlier, the two forces clashed. The chariots proved as deadly as ever, but this time the Gondorians were better prepared, and under the able generalship of Calimehtar, they gave as good as they were given. Even so, Gondor might well have lost the day, but for the second portion of the king's strategy. On the second day of the battle, the Northmen, together with the greater Gondorian cavalry, suddenly swept over the hills of Imenmuil and came crashing into the Wainriders' flank. The heathens, unused to having to fight in disparate formations, swiftly devolved into chaos. Those of them that were not slain by the Gondorian and Northmanish spears and arrows hastily broke ranks and retreated to the north of Rovanien, leaving some 6,000 dead strewn on the field. It was a decisive triumph for Gondor and the free peoples of the East, and it bought Gondor a generation's respite from the fear of the fell-red chariots of the Wainriders. Thus were Narmekil II and Marhari avenged. The second battle of Dagorlad had saved Gondor from further invasion for the moment, but King Calimehtar did not delude himself in thinking that the Seven Heartlands were safe forevermore. He had seen the fighting prowess of the Wainriders firsthand, as well as their numbers, and knew it would be merely a waiting game before they attempted to strike again. It was perhaps for this reason that he elected not to try to reoccupy Rovanien. The province had been valuable when the kingdom had had the population and treasure to garrison and defend it sufficiently, but those days were in the past. The combination of the kinstrife, the plague, and Calimehtar's wasteful enterprises in Umbar had seen to that. Hence, as with Umbar, Calimehtar resigned himself to Rovanien's permanent loss, and settled down to the business of recovery and retrenchment. This task would occupy the remainder of his years on the White Throne. In 1900, the king ordered the construction of a great tower of white stone and ivory, capped with an ornate silver spire, to honor the victorious dead of Second Dagorlad. Adjoining it was built a majestic vaulted chamber, paved with onyx and marble, known as the Tower Hall. Here the white throne itself was placed, upon a dais of many steps, with the black chair of the stewards at its base. The White Tower of Minas Tirith would remain for centuries after, as both a commemoration of Gondor's valor and the sacrifice of her people to the cause of light and justice, and as a reminder of the wise and stalwart monarch who raised it to the skies. There it still stands today, overlooking the city like a glittering needle jutting towards the heavens. For the next 30 years, Calimehtar went about quietly but scrupulously nurturing the realm's strength both within and without. A new rampart was raised on the west side of the Anduin, stretching from the river Limelight all the way down to Eastern Norien, complete with tower garrisons. A network of beacons was erected, extending all the way to the upper vales of the Anduin, where Marwini and his people had settled, so that the two kingdoms could alert each other at need. In 1911, he dispatched the now aging Kirion Amelstar to Fornost to negotiate a renewed alliance with King Arafant of Arthedain. This was duly granted, and a royal marital contract was proposed to cement the bond between the two houses of the Adain. Alas, nothing came of this, yet. It was whilst still in the midst of bringing his rearmament designs to fruition that Calimehtar died in Lotissay of 1936. Although his reign had seen the loss of more territory than any of his predecessors, those forfeitures had been more the inevitable consequences of actions and events long preceding his accession, and as such, he can be largely absolved from blame. He had rallied Gondor's soldiers and inflicted a blistering defeat upon the most formidable army Gondor had ever faced on the field. Then, by drawing back the borders to natural river boundaries, he had created strong defensive redoubts from which her armies would not be easily dislodged, and had concentrated Gondor's remaining manpower at home where it counted. Altogether, he had executed his tasks far better than almost anyone might have expected, given the realm's dire predicament at his reign's beginning. All that remained was for those who followed him to carry on his work with the same sure and judicious hand.